Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. As you can see, I am not in my usual dining room setting. I'm joined by an incredible guest, and this is a really treat for myself and for listeners. We're in Denver, Colorado today. This is Tuesday, November 29, 2022. It's snowing outside. We're just coming off of a Thanksgiving week, and we're in the Liberty Energy offices, formerly Liberty Oilfield Services, for folks who are understanding the name change. But we're in the offices of Liberty Energy right downtown Denver, and I am joined by an awesome guest for this in-person recording. His name is Dr. John Constable, and you have a few different, you do a few different things, but you are an expert on European energy policy. You've written some very interesting papers, been on some podcasts. I might give you, a few seconds just to introduce yourself and your background.
Right. I'm an energy analyst. I'm a lapsed academic. I was at Kyoto and Cambridge, in the humanities actually, but I bailed out to write about energy, and I now do it full time.
Wonderful.
And it's become acquired something of an international reputation, since I'm prepared to say very critical things about European policy, and so many other people are not. But these things happen to be true, so they need to be said.
Wonderful. Well, then you fit in the PetroNerds podcast just fine, because I'm critical of everybody's energy policy.
I've listened and I've heard you say critical things.
So there's a couple papers, and just to give listeners a little bit of a check, and I'll give the timestamp for oil prices and everything in just a second, but just to get people teed up and interested is that, one of the papers is called Europe's Green Experiment, a Costly Failure in Unilateral Climate Policy, and another one is, the Energy of Nations. Energy blindness is leading to policy blunder. And so we'll talk about some of these things, and I think a couple things I want to really do today with you is give listeners, we don't often get a chance to get into European energy policy deeply, to talk about the costs, talk about the run up to this energy, where we got to in this energy crisis, which I've spent a lot of time talking with clients, a lot of time giving public presentations and explaining where, the price spike and how we actually got here, which wasn't exactly just the war in Ukraine. It happened, actually
that's very true, yeah.
2020 and 2021. But to begin, I think we're going to start with, November 29th, 2022, WTI is hanging around the 77.39 level. Last I checked, Brent is 83.06, Henry Hub 7.27. We've seen gas come up. We're seeing pressure on oil. This is not the podcast to talk about it, but there's an incredible amount of stuff going on within China right now. I don't think it's positive. The market's viewing it a little positively, but we are seeing pressure on oil prices because of bad macroeconomics, stuff that's going on in China. And it looks like OPEC Plus may actually, OPEC Plus is likely to actually cut production to bring those prices up. Dutch TTF, and this is very relevant for this conversation, is about $40. We're just under 40. We're at 39.14. The 10-year yield and 30-year mortgage, I didn't get the exact numbers this morning, but they are under 4% for the 10-year yield. Mortgage is hanging around 6.6% and change, and that's a lot of pressure from a Fed pivot, or thinking there'd be a Fed pivot and some lower inflationary reads we've had in the past couple weeks. But that all being said, we've time-stamped this, we know the date, we know what's going on, and we know that it's winter in Europe. And I think a lot of Americans we also know that we're sending lots of liquefied natural gas to Europe right now. And so I'd love to start with, the state of the energy market, or the state of the energy market sort of in Europe, and energy policies. And we talked on the phone, and we had a million different directions with conversation, but I'd love to just know right now, given the state of the market, what's happening right now in Europe and in the UK. Right. And I'm traveling, I'm leaving to London tomorrow, so what can I expect to see?
Well, the question about the markets is actually the wrong question, because there is not much market left in Europe. Official government documents in the UK are already using the term administrative pricing, and this has been going on for some time. So we have so little market. Most of the costs imposed on the consumer in the electricity sector in the UK, for example, are now a result of policy and not of market pricing. So when you're asking the state of what is it, it's really the state of policy and the state of what's actually happening on the ground. What's the physical state of the system? Markets in oil and gas are a little bit better because they have undistorted markets for heating and also transport. But distortions are moving into those areas already, and the effects are beginning to be seen. So the state at present is that we're seeing yet another unfolding of the slow collapse of European energy policy. This is not an acute crisis, as you've said yourself several times in your podcasts. The Ukraine event did not cause the current situation. This current difficulty has been decades in the making, and it will be decades to clear it up. This is a very long-run disaster.
Can we talk about the sort of that run-up of, Chris Wright here at Liberty and myself, I think I've heard him talk about it in his speeches, and myself have talking about sort of quadrupling, huge astronomical increases in UK utility prices. Something I was following, last summer was that you could go on the Ofgem website, you could go on the, Ofgem is a regulatory body for...
The Office of Gas and Electricity Markets.
Thank you. In the UK, and you could go in there and it would say 61, utility providers to pick from, and then these utility providers went on under left, right, and center. So now you have a handful left, and what consumers were doing. Obviously, they had little recourse of the handful of utility providers left. But if you're watching energy prices, and this was sort of the September and October, where in 2021, where we really saw these prices starting to spike for electricity prices, and then every time we'd hear another story from the UK saying, oh well, we increased the cap price, so they kept increasing the caps, and we hear different numbers that the average family, the average household is capped at sort of to a certain pounds per month. I don't know where that's at right now, or what that capping, but there's pretty wide ranges, because when you hear about from the UK government, it's that it's 500 pounds per month that they're capped at, or 2,000 pounds per month, or it's an average of 2,000 pounds per year. But when you actually hear different reporting, people are saying, as small businesses, as coffee shops, as pubs, they were paying.
People have no idea actually what they're going to be paying. And when is a cap not a cap? Well, when it's an Ofgem cap, because it's changed so often.
Well, and they're not.
What is happening.
And they're paying astronomical. These folks are, at least in Europe, folks are talking about paying more for electricity than they are for rent, which is huge. That means we're paying thousands of euros, probably for electricity. But in the UK, you're seeing these rising rates, and I think particularly in that point you're making of it, that we've talked about of not being, this didn't start with Ukraine, and the war in Ukraine certainly exacerbated it, but it was sort of actually Putin sort of opening, I think, and leverage is that, the numbers, and I point this out, is that 55 BCF a day is roughly in 2021 what the UK and Europe were consuming, and 20 BCF a day is what Europe and the UK were producing. And so that gap had to be filled, and largely the gap is filled by Russia. So that massive gap is significant, because the consumption really hasn't changed. And you point out, I'm back to folding a couple things in there because I want to get into your papers, but you point out consumption has really actually, and electricity consumption has really actually declined.
This is the big story actually in the UK and in Europe generally too, and particularly important for America, because you're about to do what we did. The Inflation Reduction Act is effectively a European style.
Oh, we will definitely get into
policy.
that, yes.
What's really happened in the UK is that we've increased energy prices through policy since the early 2000s, 2005 being a key moment, key date, when the policy costs really started to bite, and energy consumption has started to fall. In the UK, total primary energy has fallen by about 30%, and it's now back at 1950s levels, in spite of a rising population. Electricity consumption in the UK has fallen by around about 22% since 2005. It's now back at levels last seen in the late 1980s. That's a terrible indicator. Electricity is the indicator of a modern society. It's a very, very effective, low-entropy energy carrier. We should be using more of it, not less.
So explain that a little more, because I know you talk about that in both your papers. You mentioned this on podcasts, and I think folks on the environmental side, folks in the environmental community on the renewable side would say, well, it's great if we're using electricity, if we're consuming less, that's a positive, right? And
it's very negative indeed, and it's a really serious indication of societal problems.
And really economic.
And deep economic problems, in fact. Jevons pointed this out, based on Liebig's work as well, that an efficiency measure and a conversion process doesn't reduce consumption. It actually increases it. Firstly, it increases demand for that particular service because it's now cheaper to use. There may be a temporary elastic limit, so what happens then? Well, the energy that you've conserved is simply transferred to another human need that hasn't been met before.
Right.
So efficiency measures actually increase consumption, always, never otherwise. Yes, they can be used to buffer reductions in energy consumption, which may result from other effects, but efficiency measures never actually cause those conservation measures. So when we see these downturns in the European curves, we know it's not efficiency, it's something else. And then you look at prices, retail prices for consumers, and of course you see that they're enormously above the G20, non-EU G20, both for industry and for households, and that's true for electricity, natural gas, and indeed for transport. Interesting in electricity, you look at the wholesale prices for the non-EU G20 and the EU, they're actually very similar. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the difference, this enormous premium that European customers are paying, that's the result of policy. It's nothing to do with the underlying wholesale price.
So there's a few things with this that I want to get into is that, many things. But so the cost is one thing, is that it's extremely expensive. And a lot of folks, I'd like to put a few numbers to that because, and you actually put some in your paper of, some 63 billion, I think, euros per year of subsidies. But we know that Germany has extremely high electricity costs. We know that the UK has extremely high electricity costs. And something I was looking at in 2021, the summer of 2021, was simply that there was nearly a 25% tax on electricity prices in the UK for basically an ESG tax. And I thought it was incredibly painful then, even more incredibly painful now, and something that, I liken to the policies that we're seeing, especially in Colorado. I'm not a big fan of Excel. I'm not a big fan of them shoving, getting rid of all the coal-fired power plants and shoving in the renewables and then passing along the cost to the consumers and not worrying about grid reliability. But in the UK in particular, what I noticed was that it was the fall of last year. You guys you have a quarterly report. The government puts out a quarterly report, which is actually quite good because you can't find this for Europe. But you had record volumes of generation capacity for the ability to generate, electricity from solar and from wind. I guess there was a little bio in there as well, but you actually had record it undershot, right? So you had all the capacity to generate wind and solar and build a ton of offshore wind and all these solar panels. However, the generation didn't actually come from that. And that was what was one of the big spikes started driving the price spike in energy. So all this capacity generation, wind and solar, and the report actually stated there wasn't enough sun and there wasn't enough wind. And typically that usually works together when it's too hot. When it's too hot, the wind isn't blowing.
Yes, and there are all sorts of correlations in there. Low wind years happen to be low rain years, so you get, if you're relying on hydro to support you in a low wind year, forget it, you're going to have low hydro as well. These are all completely predicted. I sponsored work in the middle 2008, which modelled the output of a nationwide wind fleet of about 25 to 30 gigawatts in the UK, and we could see that there would be prolonged periods when there would be very, very low wind indeed. And that is the case today, actually, in the UK.
So what happened there exactly? So we know this is, and I know you want to get into this with the US Inflation Reduction Act and what's going on here and why we're shoving, wind and solar into the grid like crazy. But in the UK, that's really, you have sort of equal natural gas power generation and wind generation. And, the UK is not someplace I would think build solar panels because it's not that sunny all the time.
We have a lot of solar, actually. We have more than 12 gigawatts right now. Very low productivity. Load factors are less than 10%. So it was a mistake.
So I think some of your and you allude to this, is how'd you get here?
How do we get so much installed? Well, we have subsidized it dramatically. The consumer has been paying, up until quite recently, well over £7 billion per year, $7 billion a year approximately, in income top-up for renewable generators. So that's transfer from consumers to investors in renewables equipment. So, of course, when you start throwing consumer funds around like that, you're going to get a lot of new capacity. And some of the numbers I presented in that Europe's Green Experiment paper, extracted from consultants' reports for the European Union itself, show that from 2008 to 2018 and up to the present day, if you add further numbers, we've spent in Europe something like $800 billion subsidizing renewables. We have not reduced costs. Now, this is a very important point. You'll hear propaganda from the industry claiming that they have actually reduced capex, or at least the cost they claim. You look at audited financial statements for wind farms and solar companies, you find their capex has not fallen very significantly. And indeed, the OPEX for wind is rising.
Oh, it's incredibly high. It's actually
terribly obvious, really. All you have to do is go and look at the audited financial statements. Why don't people do this? Why don't governments actually come clean with us and say they haven't actually achieved the cost reductions they claimed? So the subsidy has not been successful. And the introduction of these very large wind and solar fleets has not protected us against spikes in the fossil fuel markets, as we've seen when you have this exogenous shock, the invasion of Ukraine. In some sense, not a random exogenous shock, was, as you suggested, I think Russia decided this was quite a good moment to strike. Europeans are quite exposed, because what introducing all these stochastic generators has done is left the entire European system critically dependent on natural gas to secure supply.
Right.
The entire thing hangs by a single thread. So that's why it's so serious. We in the UK certainly can't fall back on coal. The Germans can. They have actually retained quite a lot of their coal generation capacity.
They have.
This is sort of a dirty secret in Germany, but an open secret. And the other thing that you've mentioned also is that the productivity of the European electricity supply industry has fallen very dramatically, partly because you've got these enormous expansions in wind and solar. So the total installed capacity in Europe has risen very, very significantly due to the subsidies because of the addition of wind and solar.
And are those I mean, there's a ton of information in there, but so that tax I was mentioning, or that ESG, that what you see on the utility, is that part of the subsidies, that massive extra that everyone's paying?
Well, there are several different subsidies, and they vary from state to state in the EU. Every mechanism is different.
Right.
We have no one carbon price. Maybe it would have been sensible if we had. We have probably 20 or 30, maybe more, apply different carbon prices. In the UK, we have several different subsidy mechanisms. We have a feed-in tariff, we have a renewables obligation, and we have contracts for difference, which aren't actually contracts, of course. And these are actually surcharges on bills. There are also covert subsidies. So we actually have legislation embedded in our Companies Act, which places a burden on companies to try to adopt renewable sources. Companies Act is very significant because it's backed up by criminal sanctions. So, little known fact, a lot of company directors don't appreciate this now in the UK, but it is a criminal offence not to report or to misreport your energy consumption and your carbon emissions. Well, of course, many big companies are aware of this, and they're moving towards renewables because they fear prosecution or lawfare from green NGOs. So that's a covert subsidy to renewables. But the financial subsidies are very obvious, and of course there's the emissions trading scheme as well,
right,
and the UK emissions trading scheme, which increases costs to consumers in addition.
So that all these, so you have all these costs, and we don't have in the US yet a forced carbon system where companies are worried about that. But if you know, I mean, I do follow this stuff in the UK, not to the extent that you do, but if you're just listening to BP's earnings call, I always tell people this, but you have to literally remind yourself that it's BP's earnings call, because there's so much talk about wind in there. Now they've had and you can sort of pull yourself back and look at it. Is clearly the UK, or clearly BP wants to have they talk about the circular economy and everything, and they want the hydrogen, and they have the convenience stores, and they want everybody to recharge, at the convenience stores and charge their Teslas or whatever they're driving, and they have all this offshore wind, and they're eventually going to bring it all together. I mean, at the time, I think a few earnings calls ago, the CEO of BP hadn't even driven an electric vehicle, so he didn't even know what it was like to charge at one of these stations he was talking about, where he was bragging about eating a donut and getting a coffee and spending your time at the shop while you're waiting for it to charge. But the offshore wind was a really serious thing, and it's been something that investors are critical of, because they want to know how much should they pay for it and when are they going to get their money back. And things that BP has alluded to is that even when they were talking about how clean and green their Russian facilities were, that they were actually greener, and there were actually less emissions than any of their oil in the world, which was ludicrous, and those are gone now anyway. But the wind was that they basically said there was a 10-year payback, and they had several issues within the earnings calls of how much they actually paid. What did you actually pay for the acreage? And they would say, hey, look, we didn't overpay, and the fact that we'll tell you we didn't overpay because we were bidding on some European stuff, and we actually didn't buy it because it was too expensive, and that should prove to you that we can restrain ourselves. And I thought, oh man, this is not a good metric if you're just saying, okay, well, we didn't buy this because it was too expensive. So no one knows exactly the payment. And I think it's really serious because in this business, in shale, in U.S. oil and gas, productivity is a really big deal. So when you talk about the productivity of your output, I mean, I have been criticized in Oxford every time I go and talk on U.S. shale of, what is the productivity of these wells, and how do they perform on a barrels per foot basis? And when you have diminishing marginal returns or any declining productivity in anything, society, economy, anything, it's an issue. So I always find it, especially when I'm talking about this too, it's not just the cost of, yes, offshore wind is very expensive in the UK. We don't even know what it costs, the payback period, etc. And then people talk about levelized cost of energy and with the subsidies.
Which is completely inappropriate for renewables anyway. We shouldn't be using levelized cost at all.
I think we're really seeing that in offshore in the US, is that people are talking about these, and we actually don't have enough wind generation, good enough wind generation, I think, in the US. But offshore US on the East Coast, these levelized cost of energy, they're trying to shove the wind in, and the first thing I always ask is, well, how do you connect it? How does it actually get into the grid, and where's your sort of backup? And I think this is where I'm fascinated by the UK is, you shoved all these renewables in, but what is the backup? And it seems like that you have to have that natural gas backup.
It's only natural gas now that responds. It's the load-flowing plant in the UK. You're quite right about the opacity of data on CapEx and OpEx for wind. They have been very opaque about it. And this is one of the reasons why I commissioned another large study published by the charity that I run in the UK, Renewable Energy Foundation. We're not pro-renewables, we just know a lot about it. I mean, the last time I checked, Cancer UK, which is a UK charity, wasn't in favour of cancer. They just know a lot about it. That's the same with us. We did a big study on the CapEx and OpEx for offshore wind. We found a lot of useful data in audited financial statements. But this can become quite cloudy for people when they start looking at public statements, or sort of overhead statements, because the data is often not given in any real detail, and the lifetime of the plant is given in very optimistic terms. 28, 25 years. Well, anybody thinks a rotating plant is going to last 25 years in the North Sea without very high operations and maintenance costs is clearly not a realistic person. I mean, it's a very difficult environment.
Are you looking at, you can look at Siemens even talking about their rising costs of their offshore wind turbines. There's nobody all the components to build these things has gone up. The actual wires and stuff that you're using to actually grid this into your, you have to take this from offshore. You have to put lines into your actual facilities, and we have massive issues with building transmission in the U.S. You guys seem to have less
it's
over there.
very, very difficult to build a transmission line in the UK. It's a densely populated country, so very hard to do that. Yes, a lot of propaganda coming out of the renewables industry about falling costs tended to coincide with relatively low fossil fuel prices. Actually, not surprising, because that's one of the principal inputs for the manufacturing of renewables. When fossil fuels start to become more expensive, then of course the cost of making wind turbines
and when interest rates go up,
and when interest rates go up,
this is the green revolution. So I think there's a lot of death knells into this that the renewable side, and to be fair, if you talk to folks in the wind community and directly in the solar community, I think some people that work in it are a little more honest than the environmentalists and the propaganda sort of around it. That being said, though, the UK, and I know offshore wind turbines are not necessarily all made in China. Most of the onshore wind turbines, the majority of onshore wind turbines are made in China, are made in the province of Xinjiang. I know I'm probably pronounced it incorrectly. That is made from coal-fired power generation, that is made from forced labor. China is riddled with issues, but it is very concerning to me that Europe has, sort of doubled down on renewables, instability, like high costs, low grid reliability, and completely got in bed with China, even after they've gotten in bed with Russia, and that didn't work out. And Olaf Scholz is going over to Germany, or just went over to China with 12 CEOs.
The climate policy trumps absolutely everything.
And the solar panels is the biggest thing, is because solar panel purchases in Europe, and I'm sure you know this, but would love your thoughts on this, is solar panel purchases in Europe have went up by nearly a quarter since the war in Ukraine. They've come from China. They've come from the province of Xinjiang. And it's mind-blowing because China's funding the war. China's literally writing checks and funding the war and with their trade with Russia. And they're benefiting significantly because of Europe is just doubling down on these solar panels. And it's kind of a lot. And what I always hear from Europeans is, but once we have the solar panels installed, we won't need all this stuff later. And it seems to be missing reality.
Well, it's quite wrong, actually. The solar panels do not have a very long life, actually, and a lot of the components in it have short lives. The inverters, after all, need to be replaced quite frequently. And with our experience already shows that having very large renewables fleets, we do have an awful lot in Europe, an awful lot in Britain, do not protect you against fossil fuel prices. You need them to guarantee security of supply. In effect, what you have at present in Europe is not a renewable system. You have a less productive and effective fossil fuel system with a bit of nuclear. So you look at the capacity curves, that's total capacities for thermal capacity, combustion capacity, and thermal overall, you'll see that it's falling. But of course demand has also been falling, but total capacity has been rising because we put in so much wind and solar. So the fleet load factor has fallen from about 55-60% in the 1990s down to about 35-36% at present. Again, that's because of falling demand and rising capacity. So you've got a death spiral here, where prices are inevitably going to get higher and higher. Higher prices force down demand, more renewables reduce the productivity of the generation fleet. This has no end. What's the European Union's response? They've embraced the signs of failure and declared them now to be a policy objective. So the forward plans for European Union policies are to actually reduce energy consumption still further. And this, as I just noted, is a recipe for economic contraction. You cannot reduce energy consumption without affecting your economic performance. Living standards are probably already falling in Europe very significantly because of these policies. 2 and 2 have not yet been put together by the general public. Perhaps they never will. I think they will at some point realise that this is the result of that. We're also seeing general weakening. We can't afford the defence budgets. We're becoming indefensible. This is relentlessly positive for China, and then they probably know it. And these are not fools.
Relentlessly positive for China and for Russia and for anyone who wants
for anybody who understands the thermodynamics.
Well, and also just an unstable and economically the pain that Europe is experiencing. And so I think you're painting a wonderful picture of this has been decades in the making. Yeah. But we've heard the European Central Bank. We've heard everyone leading from the European fiscal side or monetary side say we are looking through the basically they were looking through inflation for the energy transition. So before prices spiked, before we saw all the craziness with the war in Ukraine, as prices were spiking last fall, they basically said, hey, we have to, because of the energy transition and because we're doing this, this is the European Central Bank saying this, that we have to experience some inflation. And so they were saying, this is your European Central Bank. This is, monetary policy is saying we're so committed to climate policies that we're going to experience this inflation. We're just going to get through it and it'll be fine. And that's the ramifications for this are so significant. And then, now you have very high renewable costs and you have very high, conventional fuel costs, and you have a declining economy. And I think a lot of people forget that, Germany produces stuff and they sell stuff. And, they did very well when natural gas prices were low and particularly when oil prices were low. Industrialized economies do well when oil prices are low. And I think it's fascinating that no one pays attention to that. Economic growth and just economic stability is what creates normality. And if we don't have any, if we're looking at a downward spiral of economic growth and economic stability in Europe, this is really problematic. Not just from an energy standpoint and economy, but actually from war and volatility and strife. And Russia saw their opening. They have maximum leverage. Very little pain. They have pain economically.
It hasn't worked out for them as it happens, but
right.
They didn't work out to plan. But they thought it was a good moment to strike.
But they're still doing it.
They're in over their shoes now. They've got to carry on, I suppose. All this was completely foreseeable. One of the great surprises is that Europe first industrialized and it developed thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is a product of northwestern Europe. And yet we seem to have forgotten all that. Why did we think that adding high entropy, low quality fuels in bulk from wind and solar was actually going to be a support to economic growth? Our own history shows that it's low entropy, high quality fuels, coal initially in the UK and in Holland, peat of course simultaneously, that actually created these very large energy returns which created both freedom and economic growth.
Can you break that down? Explain what you mean by explain entropy to listeners, and I think you're going to get into your great thing of the animals and don't derive heat sources from wind or solar. So anyways, if you can get into that would be great.
Okay, we'll start off with the animals then. Think about it. There are no organisms, none, that derive their fundamental metabolic energy from wind. It's too chaotic. It's too close to random heat to be useful for fundamental metabolic energy. Yes, birds glide on it. Right? Yes, plants use it as a seed dispersal mechanism, but not for fundamental metabolic energy. If it was actually a really attractive energy source, there would be something there. It's not, after all, high temperature. It's not dangerous to living tissue or anything. You can actually extract it, but no. And the organisms that do derive fundamental metabolic energy from sun, plants, are simple and stationary. So you can't get much complexity out of this. So think physically about the real economy is generated at a very, very low entropy state. We look around us up these high windows here in Denver. Everything around us, this is enormously distant from thermodynamic equilibrium. It's incredibly improbable. How did it get here? Energy conversions. Mm-hmm. And we've been converting energy, superior energy, which has a very high energy return on energy invested. There's lots left over after you've extracted, converted, and delivered it to consumers. So you can create and critically to maintain the improbability in the human sphere. When you use low quality fuels, you're going to have a very thin margin, as we did in the past. The organic economies of the past, this has been very closely studied now by economic historians at Cambridge particularly, under Anthony Wrigley. Very, very fine books. I recommend these books strongly to you and to your listeners.
Wonderful.
Energy in the English Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
Superb studies on this, that the organic economies were dominated by their energy sector, which was land. So the prestige of the European aristocracy, what's why people watch Downton Abbey today, is that they owned practically all the improved capital in the economy. It was on the land. And indeed, a European aristocrat in, say, the 1650s, 1700s, they were employing 75% of the workforce on the land. That was their energy sector. The introduction of high-quality fuels with much higher margins meant that the power of landowners was broken. But coal owners did not replace them. That created human freedom. So you get an enormous explosion after the introduction of coal in employment types, in much larger secondary and tertiary sectors, for example, in the English economy, again, all studied by the Cambridge Population Research Group. And people have a choice. They have freedom of employment. They can do many more things. And this is all predictable from the thermodynamics of the fuels. Inferior fuels, close to random heat, like wind and sun, are going to create smaller economies with much larger energy sectors within them, dominating them. This won't be socially acceptable to people. And when I give these sort of talks on platforms, people say to me, John, you're saying we can't have the green economy. And the answer is, no, you can have it, but you won't like it when you've got it.
Right.
Because it will be a return to the kind of illiberal past when there's very little wealth outside the energy sector. Those who own the energy sector have enormous socio-political power. And we've got used to being able to do pretty much what we like. And we won't like being told what to do in the future.
I think, and that's why there was if you type in Dr. John Constable in podcasts, there's some things that pop up, and there was some interesting podcasts that you were on that were talking about likening, and obviously we're in Liberty Energy's offices, but Liberty and energy are pretty big deals, and actually fold well together nicely, as Chris Wright says. You talked about in that, and it's interesting because I think I read this, so this it's on Quillette, but it's the Energy of Nations, and some of the feedback on this is interesting because I was looking at the people posting on this, and if I listen to all the people that people post on my stuff, I don't even pay attention to it. But you have this sort of, what I saw is UK and European criticism of, this sounds like somebody who doesn't know what they're trying, something about oil companies, and somebody said, quote, "We're honestly going to compare 19th century coal consumption to now." And I was sort of mind blown because my entire career, this is always people like, we just don't use that much coal and it's declining. And I think that's what a lot of folks don't really realize is we haven't declined coal consumption. And not only we haven't declined it, particularly in 2021, and now with this energy crisis, we're increasing it considerably, especially in the places that are willing to do it.
Well, there is no energy transition. I
Absolutely, 100%.
There is no energy transition, and it's extraordinary that even something like Fatih Birol, the International Energy Agency, will actually say this on public platforms. It's extraordinary because the data that his own agency publishes shows quite clearly that this hasn't happened. 1971, total renewables, including sub-Saharan burning of sticks, is around about 13%. Today, it's around about 15%, but energy consumption has hugely increased over that period. Right. Most of that expansion is the result of fossil fuels.
Right.
So the energy transition is a myth, and indeed, historically, there never has been an energy transition.
There has not.
Václav Smil likes to say that they're slow. I don't disagree with him, except that they don't exist at all. So when you add superior fuels, all sources of energy expand. So you can see this in English data. We expanded our coal consumption dramatically through the 15th and 16th centuries, long before the classical industrial revolution, by the way. So in 1700, England was 50% energy dependent on coal. And so we were wildly divergent as an economy as early as 1700. Critically important because the possession of those superior fuels meant that we could improve our use of wind and indeed water. So you get a lot of hydropower, actually mechanical energy for mills, as a result of superior castings due to the importance of coal. So there is no energy transition, there never has been any energy transition. You get energy additions, in fact. So we're expecting something, a transition to renewables, which is thermodynamically unlikely in principle, in fact impossible in my view, and has no historical precedent. Why are we being so irrational about this? And I find this frustrating because I'm not programmatically opposed to having a climate policy.
Right.
It's rational to have a climate policy, but the climate policy has to be rational, and they just aren't.
Well, it's in many ways I think and this is something we can talk about because how do you fix it is it's been hijacked. So I get very frustrated when BBC does great coverage on many things, but they're very climate biased. They spend a good section of every podcast, every news source now on climate. And when they talk about Greta Thunberg, and they gave a little bit of criticism in her recent book called The Climate Book, they didn't say anything. It just said we need to do something. And the problem is that people don't necessarily like Colorado Oil and Gas Association. They don't like some of the things because it's an advocacy organization and it supports it represents oil and gas. It's a lobbying group. American Petroleum Institute, API, is a lobbying group on behalf of on the National Rifle Association is a lobbying group on behalf of the rifle industry or of the gun industry. Fatih Birol is now a lobbyist and needs to be represented and called out as an advocate for the renewable industry.
Yes.
And for China.
Yeah.
And because all of it's coming from China. And that is something that, it's no longer credible information. I mean, we still use it, but it's very frustrating
I agree about the International Energy Agency. The decay of the IEA is actually a tragedy.
It is it's a tragedy.
It was a great institution.
It was.
And the fundamental data in there is still very good. I mean, we all have to use it. It collects international data and produces it in similar basic formats, which is very, very useful. But the press releases and coming out of the IEA are a disgrace, actually. I mean, as we just said, there is no energy transition. They keep on suggesting there is such a thing.
Well, and they've actually said, in 2020 that they have made a clear statement that in 2020 that they would be, as we come out of this, out of COVID, that they didn't say we're advocating, but they said we need to be coming out of this cleaner and greener. Well, that's that you're advocating for something. And so immediately if you start talking to people, within the industry, I mean, if you're, you're in the space, but, go around the world, go to folks in Washington and London and Europe, people were sort of really confused about what was going on within the IEA of, yes, everybody wanted to go green. And I would say this of Columbia University and a lot of credible institutions that folks had of these energy organizations have completely fallen off a cliff of that it is come hell or high water, we're going to have this transition. And the more it's sort of threatened, the more everyone sort of doubles down on it. And I think the problem is that, you can force it. We can force this in. I don't think it'll be forced into the U.S. as much because we'll have massive economic repercussions. But as you're forcing it in, the economic repercussions are real. And I think you're seeing them in Europe and the UK. Yeah. And then that money, and according to McKinsey, what the energy transition needs $9 trillion a year, and that's $276 trillion total. The money isn't there. The economy is declining. This just will not happen. It's already sort of crumbling as we see it. So I'm curious, given that what we're seeing, and we know it's sort of crumbling and the economy is declining, is that, will there won't be a come to Jesus moment in Europe? Because we know that something you hear in the industry a lot here is that, okay, people always ask me, are we seeing France change their stance on shale gas? Are we seeing folks change their view and vantage point on LNG? Are they going to be committed to bringing in more LNG from the US? So how is this sort of playing out as we speak?
You're saying, will there be an awakening?
Yes. Is there sort of something
yes,
at one?
I think one shouldn't rely on it, and I'm cautioning friends here in the US against saying, people will wake up about the Inflation Reduction Act and realise this is a disaster. We thought this would happen in Europe. It doesn't happen because you have so much already created wealth which you can burn. Essentially, we are destroying capital at the moment to survive. So we're eating the accumulated wealth of several centuries, possibly millennia, actually. And at the moment, the consumer doesn't necessarily feel the pain. In large part, of course, obviously, because we're buying imported consumer goods from China with borrowed money. So GDP appears to be relatively high. But the real economy underneath is not looking good. I think there are plenty of signs of societal decay. We have very much reduced productive capacity in Europe. Much of it's migrated to Asia with its carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are one of Europe's most successful exports of recent decades. Mm-hmm. In fact, but so that the public may not wake up in that way. And that may be the case here in the US, particularly because the subsidies are so large that you create a large vested interest group which is prepared to lobby against any changes to the green policies, which has certainly happened in Europe. And you can see it already here in the US. So the promises of these very large transfers under the IRA here begin to buy off large parts of the American
Yep.
population who would otherwise see their interests threatened. So there are bribes aplenty in the early stages of the coercion, which may mean that you go down this track for a very long way before you become aware of what a disaster it is, as we are now realizing in Europe. By that point, it may be too late to come back gracefully or easily at all. You may be now have got momentum on the downward track. Remember, growth is quite slow. You climb slowly, but you fall quite fast. And we may not actually be able to recover easily or indeed perhaps at all from this. So don't bank on a public awakening in Europe. Don't think there's going to be spontaneous resistance in the US. You've got to stop it now.
Right.
Before it gets too
Okay,
late.
so with that, and we may end up. I think I'm going to take the moment to. We're going to break this podcast into two parts for listeners. So we're closing segment of part one here. So thank you all for listening.